A locomotive on the Severn Valley Railway, gathering steam and about to depart for Kidderminster, this week's location for the Antiques Roadshow. It's a journey of 7 miles, passing through some of the most beautiful countryside that this part of Britain has to offer. No wonder that people come from all over the world to enjoy this whiff of nostalgia for the age of steam. It is better to travel hopefully than to arrive, wrote Robert Louis Stevenson in the 19th century. Well, I might just add to that, it's better to travel comfortably, and what better way could there possibly be than this? Now, one man who must have made this particular journey countless times was Kidderminster's most famous son, Sir Rowland Hill. He was responsible for reorganising the English postal system, and in 1840 he introduced the penny post, and with it the famous penny black. Before Hill, it was the recipient who paid for the letter rather than the sender. Come to think of it, not a bad idea. If you got a letter from the bank manager, you could always refuse to pay for it. And in common with many other local heroes all over the country, Rowland Hill is remembered in his hometown in a time-honoured way. Kidderminster itself still displays evidence of its industrial past, and although one really associates the dark satanic mills with the textile towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, Kidderminster was throughout the Industrial Revolution a typical mill town. But above all, it's associated with the carpet industry. Indeed, by 1800, it had become the carpet capital of the world. The industry still flourishes here, though not on anything like its historical scale. In the heart of the town is the Wire Forest Glades Leisure Centre, and such is their enthusiasm, the first person in the substantial queue that's built up outside was here at 5 o'clock this morning, a full 5 hours before we opened our doors. So let's now join our experts with the people of Kidderminster.
This is a seriously large pot.
Well, it belonged to my great-grandfather, and then my great-auntie Elsie had it. And my father can remember as a small boy being lowered into it to get his Christmas present out of it.
How wonderful. That's terrific.
Must have been quite small at the time.
Yes, because that's a small opening.
Yes.
I'd have thought it'd been rather frightening, in fact.
Well, it was obviously the height of his excitement at Christmas.
Yes, terrific. It's Japanese cloisonne ware. The technique is to actually hammer the vase shape out of metal, usually copper, and then all this is effectively glass fired onto it, and it's then polished. And being glass on metal, it's actually very fragile. Despite its size, it's a risky object. If we look at this, we've got some wonderful chrysanthemums on here. You go down here, and we've got a dent and some cracking. Can you see?
Yes.
And you can do nothing about that. It's impossible to restore or repair, because if you hammered that out from the inside, the whole lot would just blow off. There is one other problem with it. Has it occurred to you at all? Do you see anything funny about it?
No.
It's the shape. It's the wrong shape. It goes beautifully up to here, and then it stops.
And there should be...
And it should actually come out like that.
Really?
Yeah. And what's happened, at some stage, it's probably fallen over and become very badly dented, and they've had it cut off, and this brassware has been put on in this country to cover up that damage. So it's not a perfect thing at all, but it is a monster. Date, turn of the century, 1900. Now, of course, that's going to affect the price quite a lot, but it still is a good, large, decorative lump, and that's what the market wants. I could see this in a hotel somewhere, you know, fantastic, with your pampas grass in it. I think, oh, we've even got some, looking down, now we got the, I think this would probably make somewhere around £3,000 to £5,000.
Yes.
Jolly nice object.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you know which factory has been responsible for making this porcelain?
Well, my husband was given it in about 1948, just before we married, by Baron de Tile, who was my aunt's stepfather. And he said it was Hague china.
What we have is porcelain that was actually made in Germany.
Really?
And it ended up being decorated in The Hague, or Den Haag.
Yeah.
Now, if I could take the tea caddy, it's got this wonderful sort of silver top.
A very endearing subject. A shepherdess asleep. all these subjects very typical of a period between sort of 1750, 1760. Now, the mark for the Hague porcelain factory is in actual fact a stork, but that's basically been adapted, because if I turn it on its side, what we're left with is a letter A. Now, they've tried to disguise it because the A is under the glaze. As for our stork, he's on top of the glaze. And the A stands for the Ansbach factory, which was situated in Germany. And they were the people who supplied the white porcelain to The Hague. So, we've got a representative selection here from a service of how many pieces?
We've got 31 pieces altogether.
Do you have them insured at the moment?
No.
Because I think we're talking somewhere in the region of around about 8,000, possibly up to 10,000 pounds. So it's we're talking serious money, and it seems a shame to talk about money, because when you look at these objects, the amount of pleasure that they give, you just can't weigh it up.
We'd never want to get rid of them.
Well, I don't blame you. I really don't blame you.
What we're looking at are a pair of very nice peddler dolls. They're made of carved wood, which has then been gesso covered, which is a sort of whiting to give it a base for the colour. And they've got rather nice peg joints here at the elbow, for instance. And they're the type of dolls which were made in either in the Grodner Tal area of Austria or the Sonnenberg area of Germany from the early 1800s onwards. And I would have said that this pair would be dating from perhaps the 1830s. So I say a pair, but there's actually another little tiny one at the top. It's absolutely wonderful. The one that I'm holding here is very much the conventional type of peddler doll. And what is also typical are some of the lovely wares that she has here. There's a pair of bellows I can see, and then little bits of knitting and pins. Oh, and I like the broom is wonderful with the bristles made out of pins. She is very much the conventional peddler doll there with her wares, but it's this chap who I think is absolutely fascinating. He is a sort of oriental merchant. Look at his face. It is in fact a lady's face which has been made.
Ah, that will account for his bosom.
Oh, he has got a good bosom here, hasn't he? Or perhaps we ought to call it pigeon-chested.
I think that's we had on this occasion.
Again, same sort of date as the other, but he's got a little animal fur beard attached at the bottom there. And he looks as if he's got much more interesting wares to sell. Lots of lovely little oh, no, look at this. This is terrific. There's a handheld balance here, so he could weigh out his goodies. And there's even a little, look at this, a little tiny pair of Turkish slippers at the bottom. Terrific. They are very, very attractive. And because you have such a lot of interesting trinkets with them, they're going to be quite valuable. I would say that the lady here, because she's a more conventional type, would fetch perhaps between £500 and £700, whereas the Turkish trader, I think a little more. I would have said between perhaps £700 and £1,000.
Two interesting pots you've brought in here. One, of course, coffee pot with the spout. The other having the lip, coffee jug.
Right? That's the difference.
So coffee pot, coffee jug. Let's have a look at the coffee pot first, though. The shape here, this pear shape, is typical of the mid-18th century. The decoration on it, again, all agrees very nicely with that. Beaded edge, you've got both top and bottom. That you'd normally expect to find by about 1780. So, in fact, if we you can see that the date there, we've actually got a date there of 1777.
Oh, right.
Right? So that's fine. That adds up. You still get this shape, which is essentially a mid-18th century shape at that period, but there are one or two features that actually do agree with that later date.
Ah, I see.
Now, the jug. This one actually is a bit earlier. Lovely, simple, plain life.
My favourite.
Quite typical with the wickerwork,
Yes.
with this type of jug. They normally are silver handle covered with wickerwork, whereas that, of course, is fruit wood. It's apple or pear wood. Now, that's rather fascinating to see, the coat of arms. Can you see it's in a lozenge shape? Do you know the significance of that?
No, I don't. No.
It was made for a woman.
Oh.
And a woman always in heraldry will always represent her coat of arms in a lozenge-shaped escutcheon.
I didn't realise that at all.
Well, it goes back to medieval times, and it was considered unseemly for a woman to carry a shield because that was an implement of warfare.
Ah, right.
But jolly interesting, that lozenge shape, because Maker's Mark, can you see there? Now, that's in a lozenge-shaped punch, and it's MP. Now, when women silversmiths, particularly middle years of the 18th century and earlier, when they registered their punch, they normally did the same thing, this lozenge-shaped punch, to indicate that it was a woman. So this is, in fact, Mary Piers. Mary Piers's work actually is jolly rare. I would have thought to insure that one for about £4,500, £5,000.
God.
And this one, although it's earlier, it's actually going to be less expensive. And insurance would be on that one about £1,750, £2,000, that sort of level. The reason is as much as anything because coffee pots always sell better on the market than coffee jugs, which I think is crazy, actually.
It's a shame because, as I say, that one is my favourite. It's so simple.
Those I always think are jolly good buys on the market, actually.
Well, I don't think there's much doubt about the nationality of this. From France. Do you have any family history about it, though?
Yeah, well, I do, actually. My grandfather, in the 1920s, went to a sale of the Earl of Dudley's different things that he had for sale, and he bought this table with some other types of furniture that are similar to this. And then he handed it down to my father, and then my father handed it down to me, and then I handed it down to my son.
Right. It's typical of the French furniture that would be in stately homes in England throughout, especially the last century, well, the 18th and the 19th century. The style of it is typical of about between 1740 and 1760. It's a mixture, in a way, of work, somebody called BVRB. He was known by his initials, Bernard van Ruysenbosch, in the 1740s, then a little bit later in the 1760s, the end of the Louis XV style, somebody called Jean-Francois Urban, working in Paris for the court and all the Paris nobility. There's a very easy way of dating some French furniture. It's not always easy. But from 1743, there was a requirement, the guild requirement, for all French craftsmen, the maîtres ébénistes, to stamp their furniture. And they always stamped the furniture underneath. At the end of the French Revolution in 1791, this was actually abandoned, this policy. It wasn't necessary anymore. But a lot of the French makers continued to stamp their furniture because it was built into their traditional. But in the 19th century, they didn't hide the stamp. They were looking a bit more commercial. They'd often put the stamp, as we have here, on the drawer like that. This man is quite well known to me, actually, Paul Sormani. He worked in Paris from 1827 till 1877. And what's interesting about him, his widow took over when he died in 1877 with his son, and they were working until 1934, making this type of furniture. But we can date this to prior to 1877 because of the stamp, because it doesn't have his wife's name on as well. So it's a very nicely made piece of furniture. The quality of this metalwork is not the best. The casting is good, but there's not much gilding on what we might call the ormolu, or the gilt bronze. There's not a lot of gilding, and it's all rubbed off on the edge where this has been a well-used, well-loved, practical piece of furniture. A very pretty, small ladies' writing desk. Have you got it insured? Do you know the value?
We have got it insured with a house insurance, and they sort of put a price on it around £4,000.
Right. I think you'd more likely get £3,000 to £4,000 at auction. And so I would actually say insure it for at least £6,000. It's just not enough, even though the market may be a little bit weak. This sort of thing is very popular because it's nice, pretty, small, and you can take it anywhere, even to the Antiques Roadshow.
So I've got over 100 pieces of it. All the plates, soup plates, tureens, and it was made for my late husband's family.
When one looks at it, one says, gosh, now that's a Derby pattern. But of course it isn't, is it?
It isn't.
I've never seen this pattern at the Worcester factory before, but here we have the mark of Chamberlain's Worcester. This is the ware that they were making in 1810. I think it's sufficient to say that it's obviously worth an awful lot of money.
So you reckon it has a little value? Hmm?
Yes, I think it's worth 30,000 pounds. That sort of thing.
Is it?
30 to 40,000 pounds.
Is it? Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that is interesting. I'm sure my sons will be delighted.
I mean, this is sight unseen, but
yes,
I
course.
think it's got
yes,
to be
course.
worth that kind of money.
Yes, yes.
Do you know what it is?
Looks like something to do with making golf balls.
A good guess.
What is
but
it?
wrong. I've just
Making
been
golf
told.
handles.
No.
No, nothing to do with golf.
No.
Oh, what
Horses.
Is it then? Oh, horses. Which bit? From which end?
Mouth.
So what is it then?
It's for filing a horse's teeth. How about that? One should be in every dentist, LeBros.
Well, my grandfather bought it from the Liverpool Art Gallery, and then my father had it, and it came to me after he died in 1962.
Well, this painting is by a Scottish artist, and the monogram here is J.A.H., and it stands for John Adam Houston. What I particularly like about this painting is the way that the background, this distressed brick wall with the old posters, is in wonderful contrast to the high fashion here with her wonderful cape and her undercoats and the beautiful gaiters and lovely shoes with the highlights on it.
Yes.
Make a contrast between very highly finished painting and rather distressed background. When Houston came to London, there were other artists who were painting in similar styles and must have been a considerable influence on him. William Powell Frith, for instance, who did famous paintings like Derby Day. Yes. And also Millet, who in the end was the most successful painter of his time. Have you any idea of what you thought it was worth?
None whatsoever, except it's obviously in 4 figures.
Oh, well, that's nice and confident. I like that. Well, I think you're right. It's definitely in 4 figures. But were you hoping for 5?
No.
No. I think realistically, it's worth between £3,000 and £5,000.
Yes.
So I hope that's satisfactory.
Yes,
and
yes,
at least we
indeed.
find out who it's actually by.
Yes, that's why I bought it, and I have no intention of getting rid of it anyway, because I love it, and so does my sister.
It's been in my possession for about 20 years. It belonged to a late aunt of mine, and because it's quite pretty, it just took my eye.
It's interesting because it's actually a sentimental theme. It goes back to around about 1825. The start of the 19th century, such pieces of sentiment symbolise many different things. You get flowers set with things like forget-me-nots. But this, with the key, is basically the key to my heart. And there, it's a tiny little padlock drop. So if you think about the symbolism of a key, perhaps unlocking the padlock, the love of my heart. And then suspended beneath the little ruby in that heart are 3 little coloured gems. With these sentimental brooches, quite often, the first letter of each gemstone spelt out a word. So you get sometimes the words like regard, where the first letter will be ruby, perhaps. This actually, the gemstones spell rage, and I don't necessarily think that that's what was trying to be performed there. But, it is a charming piece, a ruby in the middle, and if we have a look, turning it over, inside is a tiny lock of hair. So that lock of hair, one presumes, with that rock crystal cover, literally goes back to about 1825. And it's in excellent condition. So often with these, you find the brooch pins are broken, that kind of thing. But this is in absolutely pristine condition. So, an interesting piece with the symbolism, something a lot of people would want. And I believe a brooch like that ought to make in the region of £800 to £1,000 if you ever sell it. And to insure it, a piece like that, you've got to insure it for round about maybe £1,500. But it's a super piece, and quite rare to find one in that condition with those gems.
Oh, that's lovely.
So I appreciate seeing it.
This is a retailer's stamp, not a maker's stamp, on a similar table to yours.
Yeah.
So this is in the 1820s and 40s, when this table was made. It's very similar to yours. We just close it. And you see the same general effect of the marquetry top.
It's lovely.
But this is exceptional. What I find extraordinary is that it's so big, they haven't actually made the top a tipping top.
Yeah.
You'd expect it to have a little handle like that one and to lift up, because essentially it's made as a breakfast table to go against the side of the room when you're not using it during the day. But this one was made for a big house, big and solid. Do you know anything about its history?
We know it was something to do with Hitler, also, we've been told. And it was brought back over here after the war, and that's all we've really been told about it.
Right. It's a difficult history, that, isn't it? Something we can never prove. There's no doubt about it that these figures here are strongly continental.
Yeah.
They're in a sort of a vaguely late 17th century, early 18th century style of dress, with these lovely musicians, very typical to work done for the court of Louis XIV in the late 1700s.
Yeah.
I think if you hadn't have told me about the possible, although perhaps doubtful, we're not sure, German provenance, then I would say it was more likely to be an English table.
All right.
Because it's typical of the form of these English breakfast tables. What's interesting about these, they were made to be used and they would be covered with a cloth.
Yeah.
The value of them varies dramatically depending on the size of them.
Yeah.
And if you can get 8 people around a table like this, it tends to be more valuable than a 6-seater, because people like to have 8 around it for a dinner party.
Yeah.
Having said that, I would be frightened of using this to put wine glasses on, wouldn't you?
We don't ever use it at all. We're just too frightened of anything absolutely happening to it. So nothing's allowed on it apart from one ornament in the centre.
Well, don't be too frightened of it. I think that it's been well used over the last 150 years. It needs to continue to be used, perhaps not with wine glasses, not with water, and please never with a bowl of flowers in the middle, here.
Yeah.
I think that the scale of it, when you look down here, is wonderful. The big base with the 4 supports to keep it steady is really very unusual for a table of this size and type. And I think it probably could be a very rare German equivalent of the English circular breakfast table.
Yeah.
Have you got it insured or?
We've got it insured, but I'm not sure what it's actually insured for.
Do you remember the price roughly?
It was 2,300 that we paid for it.
Right. You would certainly today have to insure it for a minimum of £12,000.
12,000. I'm amazed. I'm absolutely amazed. Blimey.
I sent a poem into the BBC Children's Hour.
When was this?
And, I think about 1938. And I won this. And so I was a bit proud of it at the time. I was going to the art school later, and that's when it got used mostly.
It's well used too, isn't it?
Yes, I'm afraid so. I just think it's quite funny that the BBC's got its own antiques.
Yes, absolutely.
The clock, of course, is French, dates from round about the turn of the century, 1900, give or take a few years. And I call it a clock. It's in fact a timepiece because, as you probably know, it doesn't strike. It just has one winding square there for the time. It then has an aneroid barometer over here with a reference setting hand, and in the centre a thermometer. So from the point of view of the timekeeping, it's comparatively straightforward. The fun bit is up here. And as I'm sure you know, it's a beam engine.
Yes.
So what do you know about it?
I don't know a lot of its history. I know it came into the family about 25 years ago.
Well, let's just see if we can set it in motion now. And it needs a little bit of a push, but there it goes. We've got a cylinder there, we've got a 2-ball governor and an enormous flywheel and the beam on the top.
There's a huge key, as I'm sure you'll be aware.
It should wind round your side.
That's right,
as you say, a vast spring barrel. Probably will run for maybe 3 or 4 hours. Obviously, completely different clockwork than the clock itself.
Totally separate, yeah, that's correct.
Now, as regards the beam engine, the thing was fundamentally developed for raising water from the mines, particularly the Cornish tin mines, and they were shipped all over the world. Any form of automaton clock, particularly these Industrial Revolution clocks, and this is an unusual one, bear that in mind. I think that will fetch at least £2,500 at auction.
Oh, beautiful.
And get it home safely.
Well, I certainly will. Unfortunately, I managed to break the dome that it lives under on the way down here.
Well, don't feel too bad about it, because quite honestly, it really doesn't affect the value.
Excellent. Thank you.
I don't know when it was made, but it was given to as a wedding present to my grandparents.
Right. In fact, we can see we've got the mark of Thomas underneath, which nicely ties up with the lid there. And the marks there from the 1880s, that sort of period. So a really lovely set. Super, it's in that sort of condition. At auction, a set like that is going to sell for, gosh, I would think about 1,200 or so with its original case. It's a really lovely set, that. Let's have a look at this next one. Right, now that's lovely to see. Don't see so many of those in England. You see them rather more on the continent. But the splendid idea that, of course, for pouring...
Yes, it just catches it.
Just catches, so meant you could do the whole thing as a one-handed job. Now, various things have been going on here. Because if you take the main body of the teapot, the sockets and the spout, those all date from 1781. But when this was made originally, those feet were not there.
Really?
So those are Victorian additions. And of course the handle as well, with those ivory insulations. At this sort of period in the 1780s, you would have a fruitwood handle. It would be apple or pear. So what they've done is to put on the silver handle, and they've added the feet. And say, luckily, they have actually done it legally. So the little additions marked there. And the handle, can you see there? It's got a separate set of marks, which are quite different, much later, than the marks underneath. Had that been in its original state and in good condition, one would have been looking easily at £1,500 for it.
Just for the one teapot?
For the one teapot. As it's been altered, really a fraction of that, perhaps a third of that sort of value would be about as much as one would think of on that. Even that might be pushing it a bit. Now, the little one. Yes. Nice little sort of bachelor. Very pretty pot. Neoclassicism. And in fact, we have got there a set of marks which are for 1790 itself.
That's got this handle that you were talking about.
That's right. That's the colour, and that's exactly how the handle should have been on that.
See.
But I don't believe that that was made in 1790.
Oh.
What I think we're looking at there is a forgery.
Really?
And an outright forgery, probably made at the beginning of this century. There was a very famous group of forgers. They're known generally today as Lyons and Twyman. More often than not, when they put a set of marks on, and I'm pretty certain those are Lyons and Twyman's marks. Actually, let's just see whether there's a mark in the lid. Yes, they have marked on the lid there as well. That's a very funny shape to the P, the actual outline of the punch. And it's... I'm not too happy about that leopard's head mark. Can you see just there? It's got a funny sort of angle at the bottom of it, which is fairly typical of Lyons and Twyman's.
So they actually forged...
They actually forged the hallmarks.
Wonderful.
That really should go to Goldsmiths Hall, and they will bring it within the law. They'd have to take those marks out, and then if you wanted, they would mark it as a new piece. So, one wonderful one, one fascinating, but lots of things have been done to it, and one very naughty one.
Isn't that amazing?
Christopher, you've appeared on the Roadshow, as we know, for years, and you've even compiled an encyclopedia of furniture, yet we come here to Kidderminster and you find a piece the like of which you've never seen before.
It's extraordinary. It's what's so fascinating about English furniture. Basically, it's a bonnet de jour copying the French style of the 1780s. Lifts over, you can support the flat by the drawer, and it has this very unusual arrangement of these concave doors, very good cupboard space underneath, and the recess allows the sitter perhaps to get a bit nearer with their knees to write.
Why is that unusual? Because normally the bonnet de jour would be standing simply on four tapering legs without the cupboard underneath.
Exactly. But what's so extraordinary about this, and I simply don't understand the reason behind it, is if you don't mind giving a hand, it comes apart. If you come up here, put one hand under there, another one on the back, well done, that's it, and we just lift it. I cannot explain
why it comes apart in this way. Well, what could be an explanation? I mean, some enthusiast has designed a piece of furniture and given it to a cabinet maker to make,
Fine, I can understand that. Wanting cupboards below, why not? If that's what the customer wants. After all, we forget that these people were
They
making...
commission pieces.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Many of them were, most of them were.
So we're looking, therefore, at a piece of furniture that may well be unique. What does that do to its value?
Strange enough, it doesn't change the value very much. People, when you say the word unique, people imagine, think of high figures,
yes,
but not necessarily at all. And in many cases, when the thing is less practical and perhaps less elegant, with this box section underneath, or I think it's perfectly charming and should be in a museum, it's not necessarily worth any more, sometimes even less.
And the date?
1780, 1790.
And what would you expect it to fetch at auction today?
I should say between £2,500 and £3,500.
And really no different, therefore, to the value as a simple four-legged bonnet de jour standing free?
No. More interest, but no difference in price.
Thank you very much.
The pretty thing is the dial. Isn't the dial lovely? And all these Continental painted dial verge watches are very, very commercial at the moment. Date of manufacture is going to be about 1800 to 1820. And is it something you've bought, or have you got...
Actually, it's a present from my sister when I was over in Chicago. This was down in the cellar amongst all the other stuff, and she said, I'd like you to have this.
So it was over in America?
Yes,
What an
Chicago.
incredible story. But in the current market, we'd be talking of about £400. So rather generous present.
It is.
The finest Bowie knives were made in Sheffield. So all the American collectors that collect the so-called American Bowie knife largely are Sheffield made, and they was exported from England through the Hudson Bay Company and down through America. Some of these are really a joy to examine. This particular one is an American one by Tiffany. Now, Tiffany Bowie knives are valuable today, and this particular specimen should realise in auction something like £200 to £300. But this is my real gem, I feel. It's a Sheffield Bowie knife by Moorhead. Now, this is a cracker. It really is.
It's my favourite too.
Here we have for stags, buffalo and elk. So this is a real hunter's, trapper's knife. And on the other side, the hunter's companion. But what a lovely looking thing. This Moorhead one, I feel, is your classic knife. And that, in auction, could fetch £400 or £500. But in general, you have a collection here worth something like £4,000 to £5,000 all told.
This is a most attractive corner cabinet. Is there any family history with it?
No family history. My grandfather bought it at least 60 years ago from a lady whose husband had worked abroad, and that's all we actually know about it.
Right. It's Japanese, and it's typical of the kind of wares which were being exported from Japan in the late 19th and even into the 20th century. This one is really quite a good quality one, and it's very unusual to have this domed front to it. And what's nice is they've used so many different techniques on it. We've got gold lacquer with different qualities of size of the gold, and it is actually gold leaf in there. It's pure gold. We've got mother of pearl. These birds are in fact horn, and this is crushed eggshell. I was quite fascinated by this, and I spent quite a lot of time at home trying to crush eggshells to make it look like that. I couldn't do it. I think what they must do is to flatten it into the lacquer and then spend a lot of time sanding it to get it absolutely smooth. And this was picked up, this technique was picked up in France in the 1920s and 30s by a lacquerer called Jean Dunant, who made cigarette cases and so on out of it, and screens. I mean, they're now terribly sought after. These, as always with Japanese cabinets, you get at least one of them sliding. And what's good about this is they've decorated the inside with these sort of red
beautiful.
clouds. It's terrific. We've got some damage, haven't we? That's the thing that worries me.
Yes.
We've lost a bit up here.
We've got the part to that.
You've got that?
Yes, that's actually
And what
in the
about these
drawer.
bits that are missing? Well, there's a big pomegranate missing
Yeah,
there.
we got the pomegranates, and we do have the two knobs for these, but they were a little bit suspect, so we've left them.
Okay. Bit of mother of pearl
Yes,
there.
and mother of pearl for
you've
there.
You've got almost all of it.
Yes.
Well, that could be put back. And honestly, you could almost do it yourself. You could send it to have it professionally done. It would cost a lot of money. What's most important, if you don't do that, is to keep the pieces together. It's amazing how easily
We
they
did
get
actually
lost.
find them in all the drawers. That's
You
right.
did, right. I think it would sell well. I think that would probably make somewhere around £1,000 to £1,500. Jolly nice cabinet.
Yes, it is sweet.
Well, this is a nice singing bird box. It used to be my one claim to fame that I could whistle the tune down to somebody on the telephone. And if they said, oh, yes, that sounds just like mine, I'd be able to say, well, I'm sorry, it's a fake. Yes. The ones that I've seen most often come from Holland. I think that's where they were originally made. And you could either have them in this rather nice antique finish, or you could have them really shiny. And on the whole, people don't overpay for them. I mean, I think that they are attractive, and I think most people pay between £100 and £150 for them. The problems come when people buy them for a lot more than that, thinking that they have bought a 19th century one, which obviously wasn't the case with you.
Most unusual collection of gold and tortoiseshell bracelets. It's obviously a range of a jeweller showing the different designs that he could use. I mean, just to see one of them would be quite unusual, because this design is not seen that frequently. But to see 11 is extremely rare. One alone would probably be worth around £150, £200 at least. But to have 11 of them, one would have to suggest at least in the region of £2,500 to £3,000 for the whole group. But because they're so unusual, and because the condition is so fine, there's every possibility that as a group they could sell for £3,000 to £4,000.
Really?
They're very, very pretty.
Yes, they're very nice, but it's something that you don't wear very often on account of them lifting up really, you know, a little bit of fade really.
Versatility, I think, is what all this is about. This tiny, sweet, delightful little piece of furniture.
Right.
Do you know anything about it?
Very little, really. I know it was in the family home when my grandfather built the house in the turn of the century. Beyond that, I know very little.
Right. So you don't know how old it is?
No, it certainly must, I suppose, be 100, if not a bit more, but it might be a lot more than that.
Good guess. It's about 1820.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting form of marquetry and typical of France, of almost exclusively 1820 to, let's say, 1840.
Yeah, right.
So the Charles X period, Charles X period. Yeah. I love this idea of it's a little lady's writing desk or a whatnot. I don't think there's a name for it.
We've always called it a whatnot, but I mean, for want of a better name.
With the writing stuff, but it's actually, even for somebody of our size, it's very practical to use. It's a little bit shaky, it needs a bit of restoration. Very nice leather top, all works beautifully, nicely made inside, lined in maple, rosewood here, nice little drawer for a pen and everything there. Little slide here, again, this lovely sort of satin birch or maple here. It's so charming to have that. The idea of that swinging over your knees, just to write that casual little billet-doux in the days when you couldn't just pick up the telephone. What is interesting, what helps perhaps to date it and to identify the nationality is this type of marquetry.
Yeah.
It's in a type of sycamore, or what was commonly called a bois clair, a clear wood, inlaid into rosewood, which is a typical wood of the second quarter of the 19th century, both in England and France. But the idea of this was rather interesting because you've probably seen French furniture with big gilt bronze mounts. This was in the days of more in recession, if you like, after the Napoleonic Wars, when people were trying not to spend quite as much money as they had in the Empire period. And this idea is supposed to be the gilt bronze mount. It's the same pattern, roughly, but inlaid. And so this became part of the decoration, the idea of inlaying, if you like, the gold leaf mounts. And it makes a pretty, charming, and really quite rare and unusual piece of furniture. I'd have thought any antique today would happily sit here and write you a cheque for, well, at least £2,000, and possibly three. It's a very pretty little piece of furniture which needs a little bit of tender, loving care.
These are two of the most sumptuous Japanese naka inro I think we've ever had on the Antiques Roadshow.
Well, they belonged to my husband, and they were given to him by his father, I suppose about 16 or 17 years ago.
They're marvellous. They're not restrained Japanese taste at all, and they're not actually made for the Japanese home market. These are made specifically for export to European collectors who are working out there in Japan. You know about inro, do you presume?
Yes.
Yes?
They hold the Japanese seal.
That sort of thing, and medicines too. I once came across one that actually had the original medicines in it.
Oh, right.
And they were little tablets, and I think they were sort of breath freshener things. The technique itself is known as shibayama because originally, in about, I think it's the late 18th century, 1780s or thereabouts, there was a man called Senzo who perfected the technique of inlaying a mosaic of mother-of-pearl and shell onto lacquer pieces. And he started off as a farmer, and he lived in a place called Shibayama. These are both ontological subjects here. Is this a kingfisher there?
I think it is, yes.
On a branch of flowering, wisteria, I suppose?
Yes.
With chrysanthemums or peonies here above a stream. And this one here, which is a beautiful shape, and I think a rarer shape than the other one, this has two marvellous oriental ducks here. And if we turn over this one, we have more of a story here. It's a stunning design, isn't it? And it shows, he's a mythical Japanese drunkard called a shoujo. Here he is, sitting down, playing, it appears, or trying to trap a tortoise. And it's a particular type of Japanese tortoise called a minogame, with his flaming tail going down there. And this is so nice also because it's quite complete with its little netsuke of a no dancer. There we are, marvellous things.
Right.
Well, that's worth, I think, sort of 3.5 to 4,000 for that. This one here, I think is even nicer, actually, because it's more unusual. The shape is beautiful, being a double gourd. And it opens up here, and it's even lined in silver. So it is wonderfully finished, isn't it?
Yes.
I think one could safely expect that to fetch in excess of 4,000. 4.5 possibly. So you have two wonderful things, which certainly total in the area of something like £7,000, I suppose.
Well, that's very nice. But we also enjoy looking at them as well.
Good.
Right.
Long may you do so.
Thank you very much.
Well, now as we come towards the end of our show, particularly warm thanks to the people of Kidderminster today. I'm afraid the weather has been not on our side. It's been raining for most of the day. They've had to queue some of them in the rain, yet without a single word of complaint. So many thanks to them. And we end with this fine lithograph of a local character called Philip Clisset. Now, he was a traditional cottage craftsman, and he was well known in this part of the world in the 19th century for the making of these ladder-back chairs. And he made these chairs in the workshop of his own cottage, and he sold them for 2 and 6pence or 4 shillings. So, Philip Clisset, grand old man, bringing us to the end of this edition of the Antiques Roadshow. Next week, we're in Anglesey, and I very much hope that you'll join us. So until then, from all of us here in Kidderminster, goodbye.